Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, December the 21st, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headline lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our weekly current events class. I'm so glad that you tuned in. Before we get into the different subjects I want to speak about today, we have to mention that since today is our class, it's a very special day in the calendar. It's the shortest day of the year. It's the day with the least amount of daylight in the Northern Hemisphere. And, after today, the amount of daylight continues to increase. And, this was known by peoples long before scientists came around. This was known by ancient people. And I would say it's not coincidental that the holidays of Hanukkah in the Jewish calendar, which involves putting up lights, and the holiday of Christmas in the Christian calendar, which involves putting up lights, happens in the darkest month of the year. So, ancient peoples were always afraid that if the sun just one day, if the days would get shorter and shorter, the sun would just never reappear. And so they devised all kinds of ceremonies to convince the sun to sort of come back and stay. And the Romans had these festivals, and many ancient peoples did. They were very accurate in following the length of the day and the positioning of the stars and everything. And so, these holidays of light have a very ancient beginning. But in any case, for people who want to be optimistic about things, the number of daylight hours will just continue to grow after tonight. A follow-up on last week's talk, where I spent the time talking about Chile and the election that was there. During the week, the election actually did occur. And the left-wing candidate, Mr. Boric, he won. It was supposed, the polls were showing a quite a close race, but in the end, he won by 56 to 44 over the right-wing candidate. The best thing that happened was that the right-wing candidate conceded graciously. He said, Chile has a new president. I'll do whatever I can to support him. All Chileans have to unite behind him. The newly elected president said, I will be the president of all the Chilean people, and I will be there for people who didn't vote for me as well as for people who did. And so this is a normal thing that every election should have. It was only the last election in the United States where the losing candidate said, no, I didn't lose. And, everything happened as a result of that. So, Chile, which has a democracy in place since the early 1990s, had a transfer of power, a peaceful transfer of power, and now it's time to get down to business there. Of course, the international financial markets didn't like the results. The peso fell, the stock market in Chile fell, because they figure that, he's going to be unfriendly to business interests. And he said he would be. He said he would be, looking much more closely at mining projects to make sure they're environmentally sound. They would be taxing large companies much more because he feels they got away with being too lightly taxed. He wants to reform the education system, the pension system, the health system, all to help the poor and lower middle class people. And he also said he wants to lower the working age from the working week from 45 hours to 40 hours. And I was surprised that you could still have a kind of a work week where you have to work 44 hours because it's been a 40-hour work week as the standard in North America for a very long time. And in Quebec, we're so special that people in the public sector had a 35-hour work week. Just to point out that, I suppose unlike, or like many other places, the income distribution in Chile is very skewed. So 1% of the population owns 25% of the wealth. I don't think that that's that different from the US, by the way. I didn't check the last statistics, but that's pretty well what it would be in the US as well. You might have heard Elon Musk this week. He said that he would be paying $11 billion in taxes this year. Now, I think he was referring to income taxes because obviously, large companies always pay lots of taxes and sales taxes and things like that. But, for people who are complaining that he never paid any taxes, he said, no, this year I'm going to pay a lot. So we'll see what happens on that score. Again, on the economic front, there was a big news this week where in the United States, this Senator Manchin, who is the 50th out of 50 senators belonging to the Democrats in the US Senate, he said he would not support the large capital expenditures that the president wanted to make on improving life in the US. And this would go for anything to do with saving energy, cleaner energy, supporting poor people, giving a child tax credit, promoting public health institutions, promoting access to universities and colleges from poor people. It's a grab bag of items which would end up costing lots of money over the years. But Mr. Manchin, who represents West Virginia, the poorest or one of the poorest states in the United States, you would think that his people would benefit from these federal expenditures, but his excuse is, well, I'm worried about the deficit. So, if you worry about a deficit, you can always say, I don't want to spend any money, but he has his own peculiar way, and the power that he has is so great because every last vote is needed in the Senate because it's divided 50-50. And so if one Democratic senator objects, then nothing can get passed. That's the system that they have. So more than likely what will happen, and by the way, the fact that he made that one statement caused the rating agencies who measure the United States economy to downgrade the amount of growth in the US economy for next year by a whole 1%, which is an enormous amount of money. 1% of the US economy is like trillions. So his statement had that much of an effect to downgrade the growth projections. And of course, the stock markets fell accordingly, partly for that reason, partly for the COVID reason. But it's not an optimistic time to be in business right now in the US. And well, I shouldn't say that. I should say that it's not an optimistic time to be the Democratic president in the US because all of the major reforms and major expenditures that he wanted are frozen at this point. What may happen is that this bill will be deconstructed and pieces will be passed sort of one at a time, the ones that Mr. Manchin approves of. So it may be that they will do in one way what they couldn't do in another way. Anyway, that's kind of that. The rest of it, you can watch the talk shows and the Rachel Maddows and Fox News and hear all about it if you're interested. I would say that the other big news this week is really the intensification of the COVID Omicron variant, where some people have come out and said that it's as catchy or as contagious as measles. And you should know that measles is the most single contagious virus that exists, that it has been proven that you could catch measles by going into a room where there's nobody in there at that moment, but somebody who had measles had been in the room, and you could catch whatever air particles have the measles in it, and you could catch it in that way. So it goes to show how contagious it is. Hopefully, this variant is not as contagious as that, but if it is, what it sort of means is that eventually everyone will catch this variant. Luckily enough, the early results say that the variant is not as severely debilitating as the Delta one was. It doesn't seem to enter the lungs and screw up the lungs in the same way, so that's a good thing. But it's, if a small percentage of people who get COVID end up really sick, you have millions and millions more people getting COVID, then that small number of people turns out to be a lot of people, simply because the disease becomes so widespread. So it's something that we're in the state of developing. As you know, of course, all kinds of restrictions are being put on travel. Schools are closing, big events are closing, sports events, entertainment events, all this kind of things are being changed as we speak just about. And it certainly is a move away from what people thought would be getting back to normal. So it's going back in fact to the kind of most lockdown type days that we've had. And there are many people who are losing hope and whose lives are affected so drastically by all these big changes. The United States is is experiencing somewhere around 150,000 new cases a day, and the number for Canada would be somewhere on the order of 20 odd thousand. And experts have said that the 150,000 a day, the most that the US ever had in a day was like 220,000, 240,000 in a day. And they say that, with this new variant, it could go up to a million new cases a day. So, surely, even if a tiny proportion become quite sick, you end up with a lot of sick people. Something that we have to follow, obviously. I wish we could get away from it. I wish we could move our lives on to other things, but the disease is not that forgiving. That's, however, if the disease is relatively mild, people might just say, well, you know what, if I get it, I get it, and I'm not going to change my lifestyle in any big way. And it's only a tiny proportion of people, especially those who are unvaccinated or have other health conditions, whose lives could be really affected by it. So we'll have to see how each world leader and world country deals with it. And they're not all dealing with it in the same way. And science tells us new things every day. So, this is obviously going to be a subject of prime importance throughout the whole winter. Now, what I wanted to do today, let me just check my time. Okay. I wanted to circle back again and speak about a few of the interesting headlines that have come out of Israel lately. It's probably one of the most newsworthy countries. And people might ask the question, well, why is it that, for such a tiny, insignificant country of, not even 10 million people, that they seem to be in the news all the time? I think that's a question worth answering or worth looking into. And the answers come in so many different sort of, let's say, versions or types. Well, one is that because Israel is a free and open democracy in the Middle East, every news agency can send reporters and and officials and scientists and delegations and you name it to the country to report on what they see. Naturally, the reporting that is done has a lot to do with where the people come from and what their roots are and what their ideology is, etc. But the fact is that they can really more or less report in a free way in an area where let's say, lack of freedom is more prevalent, means that these reporters can anchor themselves in Israel and even sort of do reporting on other places, knowing that their jobs and lives won't be threatened by what they do report in other places. And in Israel itself, because Israel is such a vibrant democracy, a country where there were 33 different political parties running in the last election, where every Israeli has two opinions. There's so much to report because people are so willing to express themselves and to strongly identify with all the various groups and streams of thought that are in the country. So there is a lot of material there to report. It's not like you are on some sort of sleepy island where you can wake up in the morning and say nothing happened today. We'll speak to you tomorrow. There's always somebody that says something there. The government there is made up of so many different political parties with so many different viewpoints that there's always bound to be clashes and contradictions. And therefore, these are things that are worthy to report. Now, that comes from the supply part. The demand part is that there's a lot of demand for news from Israel. People are interested in the country, and people like to read about it. And so the news organizations are there to supply the demand that is produced by the consumers of these news. And whether the consumers are news networks, television networks, public broadcast networks, print networks, print magazines, etc. That kind of news seems to always sell. And so therefore, the content is being produced to fill the demand that's there from the consumer. So these are a couple of reasons why that country seems to always make news, even though it's so relatively insignificant in the whole world picture. Of course, it's also the only majority Jewish country, and therefore that puts it in a spotlight, and that puts it in a unique position because there aren't any other ones. And so this surely has something to do with the newsworthiness of that country. A few of the things that came out there this week was a statement from one of the ministers that said that because COVID has shut down tourism so completely, he's advising that anybody involved in the tourist business in Israel should change jobs. Now, this is a very big order, because you have about 140,000 people directly employed in tourism, tour guides, special hotels, the airline people, taxi people. Tourism is an enormous business. And then you have all the people who depend on those people. So the spread of tourism, the sort of net that tourism sends off in that country and in any country depending on tourism is huge. And Israel is not a country that's wholly dependent on tourism, but tourism is a big part of its economy, and it has millions of people, millions of tourists who come to visit every year. So it's really quite a large undertaking. Because it's so conveniently located on short flights from Europe, people come there for all kinds of different reasons, not having anything to do even with the Jewish part of the country, but some people just come to it as a sun destination. Some people come to it for Christian religious experiences. Some people come to it for the science and high tech, which is centered in the country, and they're coming on seminars and on study groups and everything. So it does have a lot of attraction, even outside of the Jewish nature of the country, which obviously, of course, is a big draw to the rest of the Jewish population living abroad. So that's why tourism is so important. And many people resented the words of the minister, sort of to say, well, if it doesn't work out in tourism, just we can train you for another job. And people have said, listen, we've worked in this business for years and years and years. We've studied, we've taken courses. Israel certifies tour guides, and it takes quite a lot of hours of study to become one. And there was a resentment on that side. But, that's the sort of inevitable fact of COVID, which once it shuts down an industry, the government is there to provide help for the people involved, but they don't want to provide help forever. So they might say, well, maybe you should change jobs. On the other hand, the high-tech industry in Israel is still going very, very strong. And this week there was news of the sale of a couple of companies which started in Israel. And this is a typical scenario where you have a company which develops some kind of a new idea, a new process, a new app, a new something. And then these companies are not large enough themselves to attract huge bank loans. And so the companies sell themselves by listing on the stock market or being bought outright by a big pocketed company in the US, mostly, or sometimes in other countries. And a couple of these emerged this week and were bought out for hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you have to think of that these companies started off with basically an idea, some research, some lab time, some equipment. But if they happen to get lucky and if they can attract attention, these things can end up being worth multi-billions of dollars. So we all know that Waze, what we use so often, and Mobileye, these are all Israeli companies that started off and were bought out by American giants, and we're now profiting from all of that technology. It seems as if that this sort of track record is not being disrupted, despite the fact that there are complaints that the amount of basic science being taught in Israel is not very high, that there are huge sectors of the population who are left out of the whole sort of high-tech field. And yet somehow or other, those who are left in it and those who do work in it sometimes can turn out to be enormous successes. I was just reading, and you might have read this too, that some Israeli lab has announced that they have found a way to potentially treat Lou Gehrig's disease, or lateral ALS disease. This is the most uncurable disease and the most debilitating disease that you can imagine. The body just kind of wastes away. And some Israeli institutes said, we found a way to reverse the molecule which is causing this kind of miscommunication in the body. And we've tested it out on, in the lab, and our test seems to work. And therefore, this could be the beginning of a cure for ALS. Now, just imagine how significant that is. The details of which I'm, not that familiar with, but if you want to Google it, you can find out all of the neurons and all of those molecules and the names of all of them, and it's all written down there and published. This is not some sort of announcement on Fox News or something like that. The amount of news coming out of the country is sort of, in a way, never ending and always interesting. Another one that came out this week, and this is all like within the last 7 to 10 days, was that the promise to build a prayer space for non-Orthodox Jews at the Wailing Wall has been deferred. So this is an issue which has plenty of history to it, plenty of interest to it, and I'm going to explain it a little bit in some detail. First of all, my listeners should know that I personally lived 3 years in the city of Jerusalem itself. And I got to know each and every nook and cranny in that city by just walking around and looking and exploring and talking. And I actually also led some tour groups to some parts of the city as a kind of a favor to other people who were busy at that time, etc., etc. So what we know as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall is a wall of stones, which you've all seen the pictures of. These stones were actually the outside wall of the enclosure, very, very large enclosure, which housed the temple that was built in Jerusalem, built 2 times. The last time it was built in the 400s BC and destroyed by the Roman Emperor Titus in 70 AD. In that temple, the priests held their ceremonies. It was the sort of locus of the Jewish religion and the priestly order of that religion, the sacrifices, the prayers, the coming of the people 3 times a year to give homage to God and to pay their taxes to the priests, etc. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the end of this sort of priestly, we'll call it order or cult, not in the bad way of cult, but cultivating that kind of cult, that this ended because the high priest's job was finished. And Judaism then transformed itself over the next 100 or 150 years into a kind of a synagogue-based religion that we are the inheritors of today. So the transformation was enormous. And it was done in that way. The Romans, meantime, destroyed the temple. They were in 70 AD, and about 65 years later, Jews who were living in Jerusalem mounted a revolt against the Romans again. So the first time there was a revolt against the Romans, which started 4 years previous to the destruction. And the Romans had to send in, garrisons from other parts of the Middle East to put down this rebellion. 65 years later, after the temple was destroyed, there was another rebellion. And the Romans again sent in garrisons and defeated that rebellion. Once that rebellion was defeated, the Romans said, we are not going to allow Jews to live in Jerusalem. We're changing the name of the city. We're going to knock down everything we can so that they never come back. And that explains why only the outside western wall of the enclosure of the former temple is still standing. And that is what we refer to as the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. Now, 500 years later, when the Muslims came, they conquered Jerusalem, and they incorporated in the religion many aspects of Judaism, many of the stories, many of the heroes, many of the characters in the Bible were incorporated into Islam. And so the story about Muhammad visiting Jerusalem was we'll call it, produced. Of course, Muhammad never got to Jerusalem because, it was so far away from Saudi Arabia, but there was an idea that he somehow arrived at the Wailing Wall on his horse and communicated with God, and therefore Jerusalem has become known as the third holy city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. So there was a kind of we'll call it a constructed history of Islam, tying it to Jerusalem, which began very, very early in the history of Islam. The beginning of the construction of those magnificent mosques that we have in the old city of Jerusalem started only about 100 years after Muhammad died. So you were talking about very, very early in the development of Islam. And of course, they were expanded and changed and renovated to what they have there today. The Jews continued to come to the Wailing Wall to offer prayers, but the wall at that time was kind of a kind of a very small remnant of what there was. Eventually, the city was built around that wall, and the space in front of the wall was very small. And people did come to pray there, and there are pictures of women and men praying there, or visiting the wall, I should say, without any kind of separation or any kind of, there was no official status there. There wasn't a synagogue there. There wasn't any of the kind of amazing developments that you see there today. From time to time, in fact, there were riots where local people, Jerusalem became a Muslim city at certain points, and there was clashes between the Jews who lived there and Muslims who lived there over that piece of territory, over that piece of wall. But fast forward to 1948, and the old part of Jerusalem, the old city, was captured by the Jordanians in the 1948 War of Independence, and the Western Wall was part of Jordan and closed off to Jews until 1967. So there was a hope after the 1948 war was over that Jews would be able to visit their holy places in the old city, but this did not produce itself. This did not happen, and a kind of gates and fences were built, and Jews were completely cut off from the old city for 19 years, from 1948 until 1967. When the 1967 war took place, and Jerusalem was captured by the Israeli soldiers, going to the Western Wall was the first action that they took. And of course, there's all kinds of pictures of how happy they were to retake this holy site. And that it was immediately understood that Israel would, no matter what would happen in any future negotiations with Jordan or with the Palestinians, that the holy sites in Jerusalem would never go back to being under non-Israeli rule. And that, of course, has been the case. What did develop was that the area in front of the Wailing Wall, which was a part of the Muslim quarter, was all knocked down, and this enormous plaza was built there. And the jurisdiction to run this site was given over to the Orthodox rabbinate. So the question always was, well, is the Wailing Wall itself a kind of a Jewish national site, or is it a religious synagogue-based site? And the answer was that it's a Jewish religious synagogue-based site. This was part of the kind of a political, well, something happened to me there. This was part of the, oh, there we go. This was part of a political arrangements always between the Netanyahu government and the religious parties who supported him. So it was a small price that Netanyahu, who is a secular Jew, figured, well, since only religious Jews are interested in this place, and since they're demanding total jurisdiction over it, it's a small price to pay to give it over to them. And so a wall separating men and women was erected. As in Orthodox practice, men and women don't pray together, they pray separately. And so this kind of division was created. And even for non-religious Jews who wanted to come to visit the wall and not pray there, they were directed according to their gender to either a woman's part or a man's, the male part. And that's the way it's been since 1967 up until this very day. However, during the course of time in Israel, there developed a kind of a new attachment to religion by some Israelis, but the religion that they were attached to was not Orthodox Judaism, but not Orthodox Judaism. So in other words, what we would call conservative Judaism, liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism. Historically, Israelis were either Orthodox or not religious at all. And in the sort of second and third generations after the founding of the state, and because of ties between Western Jewry and Israeli Jews, many Israeli Jews saw the need to practice some form of Jewish religion, but not in an Orthodox way. And so when women in particular wanted to pray themselves, but in a non-Orthodox way, and when Israeli men wanted to pray together with women at the Western Wall, obviously problems developed because the Western Wall is run as an Orthodox-only synagogue. And so clashes took place and are continuing to take place for the last 20 odd years between these two streams of Judaism. And in particular, Jews from the United States who are a majority non-Orthodox have always spoken out to the Israeli government to say, when our own people, when our own citizens want to go to the wall with their families to pray together, they are being prevented from doing so, and even worse, being attacked, harassed, spit on, urinated on, etc., by the Orthodox fanatics who are trying to keep the wall as a one type of Judaism only site. Eventually, the government of Israel was prevailed upon to create a separate prayer space for non-Orthodox Jews. And those of you who have visited the Western Wall realize or understand that there is a kind of a pathway slash, we'll call it an entrance or a gate which leads from near the Western Wall Plaza up a slope and going into the we'll call it the plaza on top of the Western Wall. So this gate is called the Maghribi Gate, or the Western Gate in Arabic. And it's the only official way that Jews are allowed to go into what's called the Haram al-Sharif, or the plaza where the temple actually once stood. So in other words, to visit the mosques, that's how non-Jews are allowed to go up there. Now, however, that the wall itself, the actual structure of the Western Wall continues on the other side of that gate. And it's on the other side of that gate that it was proposed to build a special prayer area for non-Orthodox Jews. Now, this proposal was brought to the government. The proposal was that there would be only one entrance for all Jews to go and pray at the Western Wall. And once they go through that entrance, they could either go to the right to the non-Orthodox area, or to the left and center to the Orthodox area. And that the kind of a prayer space would be created, a platform would be created at the wall for non-Orthodox Jews, that services would be held there according to non-Orthodox practices. In other words, men and women could pray there together. Women could wear a talit. The Torah could be read by women. Women could sing the prayers out loud. All of the things that Orthodox Judaism prohibits. And this was agreed to by Mr. Netanyahu and get this, by the Orthodox parties who are part of his government. However, when the agreement was made public, the members of the Haredi community were so outraged that they demanded that their leaders in the Knesset change their minds, which they did. And so Netanyahu had to back down on this proposal, and the whole thing was shelved. A new government gets elected, as you all know, a non-Netanyahu government with no ultra-Orthodox parties in the government. And part of the agreement that was signed by the different coalition members was that they would revive this plan for a non-Orthodox prayer space at the Wailing Wall. This is especially proposed or backed by the secular parties in Israel, by the non-Orthodox parties in Israel, by the sort of left-wing parties in Israel. And it was part of the platform that the government approved when they got elected. Well, lo and behold, a religious affairs minister who is part of Mr. Bennett's party, who is an Orthodox Jew himself, was, we'll say, reluctant to start the process to make this transformation of a prayer area. And when there are women, a group of women called Women of the Wall, who show up once every month on the new month day, in other words, the first day of each month, to pray together. Very often yeshiva students are sent to beat them up. And this, of course, happened, this past new month. And the religious affairs minister said, oh, well, wait a minute. If, women praying are causing such sort of disorder, maybe we shouldn't go ahead with this Western Wall project. So in other words, he's blaming the victims for the aggression that happened on them and saying that the disorder caused is a reason not to go ahead with this issue. And the government made a decision, Mr. Bennett made a decision to postpone indefinitely the creation of a prayer space for non-Orthodox Jews. Mr. Lapid, who's the number 2 man in the government and the man in the government that has the most seats of any party, he disagrees with this, but they don't want to break the coalition over an issue which is of importance to not all that very many Israeli Jews. In fact, Mr. What's his name? The Religious Affairs Minister, Matan Netanya, I think is his name. He said, well, most Israeli Jews are Orthodox, and so therefore, why should we cater to the non-Orthodox population? Of course, he's not right in saying that most Israeli Jews are Orthodox. I think what he was saying is that most Israeli Jews who are religious are Orthodox. There's a very big difference from saying most Israelis are Orthodox, because if you take the number of people who are not religious together with the number of people who have a different way of practicing Judaism, those numbers are probably close to a majority or a plurality, we'll call it, of Jews living in Israel. In any case, this elicited huge amounts of complaints from abroad. And one of the principles of this new government was to have better relations with the diaspora Jews. But how could you do that if you're not going to provide a place for them to pray when they come to visit Israel? So this can of worms, we'll call it a can of worms, has been opened up. And it's one of the problems that the Israeli government has to deal with, but certainly not by far and away, not the most important one, which, right now is the whole COVID epidemic in the country. But just to let you know how this thing all developed. So Matan Kahana, that's his name, the Religious Affairs Minister. He said that, by putting off this sort of establishment, it takes away an excuse for Mr. Netanyahu to rile up the religious people and cause trouble. So in other words, he's saying, why give them an excuse? Why make a target of ourselves? Let's just postpone it. And so it kind of shows that intimidation and might makes right. But there is a lot of opposition to this within the government. There are also, of course, the people who want a different space to pray are not just, we'll call them conservative and Reform Jews, but there are Orthodox Jewish women who want to pray separately from men, but who also want to be able to sing and read from the Torah, which the Orthodox men don't like and don't want. So they are a kind of a subgroup of the people who oppose the current situation. That's that. Now, so that we're going to leave aside. We've discussed that issue. Now we're going to go on another issue that came up this week. Let me just check my time again. Okay, I've got so much more to go. I can't even. The problem in Israel of violence by settlers on Palestinians has been brought up this week by the Biden government. And this is an ongoing problem which started off in a very, very small way, but which has increased to becoming almost an epidemic. That is to say that there are some very radical, small group of people who live in what is some people would call the West Bank and other people would call Judea and Samaria. In other words, areas occupied by Israel after the 1967 war in the West Bank of the Jordan River. And these people, over time, settlements were created, settlements of Jews were created. Infrastructure was created to serve these settlements. In other words, schools, roads, clinics, yeshivas, etc., etc., etc. And these settlers, a minority of whom have become very aggressive against the Arab neighbors that have lived there, from before 1967. And the aim of these settlers is to intimidate these people to leave in order to either expand their own settlements or to create new settlements. The means that they use to intimidate these people includes physical violence, burning down their olive trees, stealing their sheep, throwing rocks at them, etc., etc. Now, sometimes these actions are a kind of a two-sided fight. In other words, that the Arabs fight back, and sometimes it's not a two-sided fight. Sometimes it's a one-sided fight. There are also cases, as happened this week, where Arabs will attack and even kill a civilian who is driving or walking in the area. And it happened this week that one of these settlers was killed in that way. However, the law and order side of it, the police who are supposed to enforce the peace and quiet in the area, inevitably are there to protect the Jewish settlers and not to protect the Palestinians. And this is something which has been that way since the very beginning. And there are numerous people who go to those areas to try to witness what's happening there on the ground. And these might be left-wing people who are against the settler movement, who are against the establishment of settlements in the West Bank. And these people themselves are beaten up by the settlers. And the people who are there to enforce the law and order, which is the army, most often don't intervene in these fights. And when they do intervene, they most often intervene on the side of the settlers against the Arabs who are being the sort of victims in a certain way of these actions. The army does not see itself as a neutral party to keep peace and order. They more or less see themselves as the protectors of the settlements themselves, because they view the Arabs as hostile or as potential terrorists. And some of the Arabs are terrorists themselves. And so you could see this sort of balance or equilibrium is not steady in that whole fight. But what's happened more and more is that there are more and more attacks by settlers on, we would call them civilians or innocent people, including school children walking to school. And third parties are there to witness these facts. And they're brought up sort of to the Israeli government and say, well, what are you doing about this? Now, when Mr. Trump was in power, he couldn't care less about what the Palestinians were suffering. But under the Biden administration, there are people in his government who want there to be responsibility for these attacks. And he has told his Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, I want you to put up this fact or put up these incidents in front of the Israeli government and make them responsible. So that's what's happened this week. This week, there was a demonstration by settlers who went to Arab villages and said, this is our land, only Jews will live here, you are animals, you are dogs, this land belongs only to us, deaf to Arabs. So this was recorded and played to the American envoy. And, unlike in the Trump times when Mr. Friedman, who was the ambassador to Israel, he would dismiss all of these things as minor incidents. The new Biden administration wants Israel to answer for these facts. The thing is that the soldiers who are there themselves are often coming from the same background and the same schools as the settlers themselves. Some of them, sometimes there are so many now Orthodox soldiers who come out of the National Orthodox sort of school that, they eat with these people, they're related to them. How are they supposed to arrest them when they cause problems like this? So this is a problem that the government will have to deal with, but you could see that it's becoming, from what used to be a very once in a while event, to something that happens much more often. And there have been deaths in the Arab community by settlers who have firebombed their houses, or shot them, or threw rocks at kids, and the kids somehow end up dying. The army will always arrest Arabs who are attacking Jewish settlements, sometimes killing members, as happened this week. But they never arrest and never put in jail the other side. It happens so unusually that when there is actually a case, it makes the news, because normally speaking, these things are not commonly dealt with. The violence is getting bolder and bolder. There are more and more attackers in each incident, and they're not afraid of the police or the army. In fact, sometimes the settlers are attacking the police and the army, and only when that happens do they actually get arrested and charged. But they're charged not with, let's say, beating Arabs up, but they're charged with attacking the soldiers themselves. Haaretz, which is a left-wing newspaper, called the latest attack a pogrom. The overall strategy is to force the Arabs to move out of the areas that they're living in. And very often the army cooperates in this strategy by declaring large areas of land where Arabs would graze their animals as military zones, and then puts fences up around them, and then evicts the people from those areas or prevents them from using them. On November 18th, the defense minister finally called the military, the police, and the intelligence to a meeting to deal with settler violence. So this is really the very first time that the government has recognized this as a kind of not a one-shot deal or not a once-in-a-while thing, but as something that is an ongoing problem. And obviously, they wouldn't have called this big meeting if the settler violence didn't exist. Soldiers are not told to stop settlers or to defend Palestinians. And the meeting said that the soldiers do have to regard this as part of their job. So this is really a kind of a big change. Now, the last, time has run out. I want to speak about probably one of the most important events in Israeli politics, which happened again also this week, which is that and I think maybe we'll continue this next time, is as you all know, that an Arab party joined the government for the very first time since the history of the state of Israel. The United Arab List, led by Mr. Abbas, is part of the government. And he made several speeches, including one this week, which said that the Arabs have to come to agree that Israel is a Jewish state, that you can't regard collective rights for Arabs and collective rights for Jews on the same page or at the same level. That part of Palestine was created in 1948 as a Jewish state, specifically as a Jewish state. And we Arabs who live in that part of Palestine have to understand that we are collectively not on the same page as the Jews who founded their state for them. But our job is to ensure that we have equal rights as individual citizens, and that we are not discriminated against and we're not neglected, and that we participate in the government and participate in the life of the state in order to advance the state as a whole and in order to advance our rights as Arabs specifically. So this is really a kind of a very major and revolutionary speech and idea and thought from people who for 70x odd years have said, well, we really hope that one day Israel will be destroyed by Arab or Muslim forces outside of Israel, and then we'll be able to be the bosses in the state. Or failing that Israel will somehow one day be a kind of a sort of neutral secular state, like states in Germany or France, where a person's background and religion is neutral and everybody will be considered equal. In other words, what they call a state of all its citizens. And this is the policy which was adopted by most of the Arab parties in Israel, saying that Israel should not be a Jewish state, but just a kind of a secular state, and everyone should be equal inside that state. Mr. Netanyahu passed the nation state law, which specifically said that Israel is a Jewish only state, and that the Arabs in Israel who are not Jews have no collective rights whatsoever. And Mr. Abbas, who said, look, I did not support this law, I voted against it, but reality is reality and we have to live with it and make the best we can of it. He was accused, of course, by the other Arabs as being a sellout. He was accused of abandoning the dreams that the Palestinians had for collective rights. But he said, listen, we haven't gotten very far with that idea up until now, and let's sort of change our tune and act as a responsible minority and not get steamrolled because we are trying to take apart Israel as a Jewish state. So he made this statement to an Arab broadcaster. He's said it many times in public in on the Israeli TV networks and in the press and the public. And he's saying, listen, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If we can get advantages by participating in the government and make the lives of Arabs better, so I was elected and I made the right choice. If it doesn't work out, well, then we'll have to see. One of the issues and he won several, as you know, for being part of the government, he won several sort of, we'll call them programs for the Arab citizens, some of which were the recognition of Bedouin towns as belonging, as being official. Remember that his vote, half of it comes from Bedouins in the south of Israel, many of whom live in what's called unrecognized communities. In other words, they camp somewhere, start to build houses, start to build permanent settlements, and then they demand that these settlements be recognized by the state. They demand that schools be built, that clinics be built, and most importantly, they demand that electricity be provided to them, because without electricity, they run these diesel generators, which are dirty, smelly, and dangerous, to provide electricity for their encampments. But these encampments include, they're not an encampment of 40 people, it's an encampment of 2,000 or 3,000 people. So the government did agree to do this. However, the interior minister happens to be Mrs. Shaked, who hates Arabs, who doesn't feel that Arabs have any place in Israel whatsoever, and who's done her best to try to delay, cancel, postpone any of the sort of agreements to make Arab lives better in Israel. And as an interior minister, she has the power to do this. Another one of her powers was whereby there was a law which said that Israelis who marry Palestinians, that these Palestinians don't have a right for permanent residence in Israel. But this law was passed kind of on a year by year or a few years at a time basis. This time, the United Arab List said, we're not going to vote for this law. And so it expired just on its own. In other words, it was not renewed. So when Palestinians went to register their spouses as Israeli residents, they should have been registered. But Mrs. Shaked, who runs the Interior Ministries, told the clerks, don't register them. But she had no legal basis to do that because there was no law saying that they're not allowed to be registered. So, this is part of the struggle that Mr. Abbas has to show his own people, look, we can get positive benefits from being in the government, but he's being opposed by Mrs. Shaked, who has sort of the direct day-to-day responsibility for some of these decisions. Anyway, this is all supposed to be worked out in negotiations between the two sides. And each of them says, well, if I don't get my way, I'm going to quit. And if they quit, then the government falls. Remember, the government in Israel is as strong as the democratic government in the US. In other words, they're there by 61 to 59, rather than being 50 to 50 in the Senate. So it's pretty well the same thing. If one person changes their mind, the whole government can collapse. He has won budget increases for his Arab municipalities. He's won the hiring of more Arab police to deal with the violence that we were talking about last time, and maybe we'll get into it another time because my time is up already. He's won several practical reforms to help the lives of Israeli Arabs in the country already. And of course, he's hoping for much more. Yeah, I didn't speak about the problem of violence in the Israeli Arab community, where there have been 5 times more murders among the Arabs than among the Jews. But this is a whole other issue dealing with them, which Mr. Abbas is enlisting the government to try to help to solve, because up until now, they've always ignored Arab violence because they said, well, we don't care about it. And if they're killing each other, why should it be our problem? So now Mr. Abbas is saying it's the whole society's problem, so do something. So I'm going to stop there and see if you have any comments or questions. And, let me hear what you have to say. I'm sure some of these are controversial subjects, and you must have strong opinions about some of these things. So let me hear what you have to say. Angela, any action there? Any raised hands or messages?
No, not yet.
Okay. Let me just look at my notes for one little second here while we're waiting. There was Mr. Abbas also sponsored a request to build an Arab hospital. There are no Arab hospitals in Israel, and there is no Arab university in Israel. Many times in my past classes, I've sort of compared the situation of Arab Israelis to English Quebecers. There are certain things that are quite parallel in the existence of both these minority groups, but the Arabs are a much larger minority group, meaning about 21% of the population, and English Quebecers are only 10% of the Quebec population. But we have institutions which we run, like our hospitals and universities, which the Arab Israelis don't have. On the other hand, of course, the Arabs have situations that we don't have. In other words, if you go to an Arab town, there's no such thing as a sign law. The signs are in Arabic only. Life is carried on in Arabic only. They have kind of the cities and municipalities that they live in are able to communicate with their residents in Arabic only, and not have the sort of Bill 101 type laws which impose French in a unanimous way over all of Quebec. So in Arab towns and villages, life carries on there exclusively in Arabic and not in Hebrew at all. But of course, in schools, Hebrew is a compulsory subject, and you can't graduate an Arab school and get your high school diploma without passing Hebrew as a subject. And of course, since Hebrew is the sort of national language in Israel, and Arabs, if they want to work outside their own small little communities, they'll have to learn Hebrew. And some Arabs, including the late minister, the late Knesset member Emil Habibi, won an award that's given every year for the best Hebrew spoken in the Knesset, and he won that award a few times because he was just so proficient and so poetic in the way he spoke. So there are many bilingual Arabs, and especially because so many of them work in the healthcare system as doctors, as nurses, as pharmacists, in hospitals, which, as I said, there is no Arab hospital, so they're working in Jewish hospitals. Their Hebrew is perfect. Even in the Gaza Strip, which has no contact with Israel whatsoever, there are Hebrew classes being given. They teach Hebrew in the university there. High school students learn Hebrew. And because Hebrew and Arabic are cousins as far as language is concerned, in Arabic is really the easiest language for people who speak only Hebrew to learn, and vice versa. So it's just a natural kind of thing. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, I'm going to thank everybody, and hopefully you've enjoyed the subject, and will come up. It will come up again, of course, because it's always there in the news. And again, if you've got any suggestions for subjects, please email me, or please let Angela know, and she'll email me. And I'll see you all next week.
Next week, there's no programs. You will be.
No. Okay, sorry. Yeah, that's because of the holidays, right?
Yes. So Mr. Dwoskin will be back on the 11th of January.
Oh, the 11th of January. Yeah. So we have a couple of weeks off.
Yes.
So listen, everyone, be safe, be careful, and have a happy new year. And we'll all hope that 2022 is a better one than 2021 was, and 2020 for that matter. So we'll see you all on January 11th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in over the telephone and on Zoom. We shall see you next year. Happy holidays.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, done and done.